Hello and welcome to this update for A-level business teachers. The aim is to try and help you make some sense of the mechanism for awarding grades this year. My name is Colin Leith and I work for Edexcel as a subject advisor. Our agenda starts with a very brief background, then we'll look at the QA process. The main item is going to be about the 5 steps. And these 5 steps look at the evidence you might use, and we'll try and look at the questions you might be wondering about regarding the evidence. That will then lead us on to grading. To finish with, I'll be talking about the additional assessment materials we've produced and then the other support that we have for you. So let's start with a bit of context. As you've probably heard, the key principle this year is that learners will be assessed just on what they've been taught, and it will be the teacher who determines the grades drawing on a range of evidence. This evidence could be marks from class activities, homework activities, mocks, but the key principle is that the teacher will draw on that evidence to determine a teacher assessed grade, or tag. Most of the dates on this slide are in the past, but you are probably aware of the 18th of June deadline on this slide. The 18th of June is the date or the last date when you can submit your tags. There are a couple of other important dates. From the end of May through to the 18th of June, there will be a window during which you can enter your teacher assessed grades. You'll see at the bottom that results are a little bit earlier this year than normal. For A-level, the results will be on the 10th of August. So let's start with the JCQ guidance. The Joint Council's website has got templates for centre policies which your SLT may already have used, but there is also a template that you might want to use for your own assessment record, and this is where you would detail the evidence that you've decided to draw upon for your basket of evidence that will contribute to the grade. The JCQ emphasises the importance of the centre policy. The centre policy is what sets out your centre's approach, and it describes the process that you are going to use. It also outlines the internal quality assurance in your centre. The centre policy describes also about how you will use historical data. For example, the 2017 to 2019 results. And the centre policy also has a section on how authenticity will be assured. Authenticity in terms of knowing that the learner's work you have in front of you is actually theirs. The overarching quality assurance process is described on this slide, and there are 3 steps. The first step has already happened. This is when your centre submits the centre policy. The second step is a review of these centre policies where the awarding organisations like Edexcel have a look at each centre's policy to see that it's in line with expectations. And if it's not, then we will provide support to amend that centre policy so that it does fall in line with expectations. After the 18th of June, there will be some sampling to see if the centre policy has been followed and if the evidence provided is in line with the grades submitted. There is more information in the Off-Qual blog last week on how the sampling will work, and there will be more details on how that will work after the 18th of June. So what we have is a centre policy, a review of centre policy, and then post the 18th of June sampling to see if the centre policy has been followed. Those essentially are the steps. Now we'll look at grading, and this is going to be the main part of this briefing. You are going to be grading following your centre policy, but there are some issues that you might be interested in hearing now because they might help you over the next couple of weeks to decide on how to collect your basket of evidence, what to include in your basket of evidence, and also what weight to give different components in your basket of evidence. In doing that, you will probably have heard of the 5 steps, and these are on this slide. The 5 steps are also detailed in a JCQ document on their website, which is entirely devoted to the 5 steps. And it's the key to everything that you're going to be doing. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time just looking at this slide here and what it might mean. First is a recognition of the principle that your students should only be assessed on what they've been taught. This is in recognition of the disruption that your students and your centre has faced this year. And that disruption will differ from one centre to another, but also it'll differ between students. So you have to consider what has been taught. Have you taught all 4 themes, or have you perhaps not had time to do or finish theme 4? Your individual circumstances will dictate what it is that you've taught this year. For A-level business, the content is perhaps less important than the skills. So if your learners haven't covered all the content, then they can still demonstrate the skills of recall, application, analysis, and evaluation. And that's going to form the basis of the evidence that you collect. Now that evidence could come from a variety of places. So when you start collecting the evidence, you might, for example, consider mock exams. It's possible that during the course of years 12 and 13, your students may have done a mock or 2 mocks set by you. You may have set internal tests, so that would be another possible form of assessment. You may have done an end of topic test, for example, at the end of each of the subdivisions of the themes. You may also have asked your students to do substantial class assignments, or you may have set them substantial homework tasks that they did during the remote learning period during the lockdowns. So there is a variety of bits of evidence that you may have at your disposal. There's no official minimum in terms of how many pieces of evidence you should submit, nor is there a maximum. When you're considering this, you might want to think about the amount of assessment that your students would normally undertake in their summer exam series. Now, normally, they'd be expected to do 3 2-hour exams. So if you're planning to do a lot more than that, you might question whether it's necessary, because you might be over-assessing the students. If you're doing considerably less, then it might be that you haven't had the opportunity to do as much, so you may look at other evidence that's been collected in maybe not such high control conditions. But if you've done a full pass paper or a couple of full pass papers, then clearly these are going to be important evidence that you would want to consider. When you're looking at what to assess, it's important that you get evidence from across the assessment objectives. And one of the ways of doing this is to make sure that you've used all of the command words. So, when you're designing the assessment evidence, try to make sure that you're using explain, calculate, draw, assess at 8, 10 and 12 marks, and evaluate. If you do this, you will ensure that all the command words and all the assessment objectives have been covered. So that means choosing a range of question types and trying to include all of our question types using the points-based and the levels-based mark schemes. Fortunately, we don't have that many question types, so it shouldn't be too difficult to make sure that you use them all. How many 20-mark questions should you have evidence of? I don't think there's a specified number, but the 20-mark question, the evaluate question, gives you the ability to show that your students have been tested on the skill of evaluation, and in that 20-mark question on evaluation which requires a decision or a recommendation. Do you have to use past paper 3s? Well, no, because those same skills of analysis, evaluation, application, recall, of course, can be demonstrated in papers 1 and 2. So you don't have to use paper 3. But paper 3 is very good at determining the actual levels of response type answer that we expect for grades A and B. Clearly paper 3 is synoptic, and if there are parts of the specification you haven't covered, you would have to make sure that the paper 3 you choose is not assessing these. Your learners won't have done the research, but a student should still be able to achieve a grade A in normal circumstances in paper 3 without doing any research. So there should be enough material in the extracts A to H for students to demonstrate their skills. And of course, in paper 3, all the questions are levels of response question. In your assessment record, there's a box where you state what your evidence is going to be, and it asks that the evidence contains all of the assessment objectives. Well, you can tick which ones it does. So clearly it would be a good idea for the evidence that you choose to reflect all of those assessment objectives. And please don't forget the quantitative skills. Remember that A-level business includes 10% quantitative skills. And that means that when you're looking at the range of evidence across the assessment objectives and question types, try to include maybe a couple of calculate and construct or draw questions so that you're assessing the quantitative skills. And in the higher tariff questions, make sure that the data includes some figures, graphs perhaps, that the students can analyse from the case study. Now I'm back at this slide again, the 5 steps. The evidence you've collected then has to be evaluated. So step 3. The idea here is not that you look at all the evidence equally, but that some evidence might be weighted differently from other evidence. And this is where there's a template on the JCQ website with the assessment record. This is where we're going to look at the last column, which talks about high, medium or low control. Now the page from that assessment record that I've got on the screen here The writing's probably quite small, but if you've seen it already, or even if you haven't, in the right-hand column, the very right-hand column, you have this HML, high, medium, low control. And this is where for each piece of assessment that you use, so they're listed in the left-hand column, you say which theme it's from, which assessment objectives are being covered, and then in that last column, whether it was high, medium or low control. Now, broadly speaking, what they're getting at here is that something that's high control would be like a mock. A high control assessment would be something that was invigilated and timed. Not using textbooks, not using notes. So an exam or test where the students are undertaking a timed assessment, possibly in the hall with invigilators. At the other end of the scale, low control could mean something that's been done at home, maybe during the lockdown, or homework tasks that you've set. So this would be a task where you haven't supervised it, where the students have had access to textbooks, to their notes, to the internet. So all of that would make it low control. Medium control is somewhere in the middle. So medium control might be supervised, not invigilated, but a supervised task that you may have done in class. Maybe it wasn't timed. Maybe students had access to a textbook or to their notes. So that would be more medium control. Now in this step 3 of the 5 steps, when you're evaluating the quality of the evidence, the reason that the JCQ document has this HML column, high, medium and low control column, is for you to be aware of this and maybe take that into account when you're giving weight to the different types of evidence that you might consider. And the implication is that you might give a higher weight to something that has been produced under high control compared to something that's been produced under low or medium control. So let's go back to our 5 steps again and now look at point 4. In point 4, you're asked to establish whether the proposed range of evidence is suitable for all students. Now the idea here is that you're trying to get something that is common across the whole cohort, and JCQ calls this consistency across the cohort. You may have had different classes studying A-level business with different teachers. One of the things that the document makes clear is that there is an expectation that there should be some sort of consistency in the use of evidence, and by this is meant they don't want a differentiated approach. The same evidence should be used across the different classes in the cohort. Now this may be difficult if you've, for example, conducted some high control tests where you had high absence rates, but as far as possible you'd want to try and make sure that the evidence is used consistently across the cohort. So when you're completing the template about the evidence that's going into your basket, the intention is that there should be this consistency. It may not always be the case because there will be, of course, individual students who've missed more teaching time than others, or who've missed more assessments for perfectly valid reasons. So the template has an element in it where you can record the position of individual students who are not going to have the same evidence as the rest of the cohort. But the idea for consistency is that you should have the same approach across the whole cohort so that it's being assessed against the same evidence. The other aspect of consistency is that if you've got more than one class excuse me, and more than one teacher, you're going to need some sort of internal standardization as well. So you'll need to budget some time for that internal standardization to make sure that you're assessing along the right lines, or at least assessing along the same lines. The other thing to make clear with numbers 3 and 4 here, when you're evaluating the quality, is to think of students who might have improved from year 12 to year 13. If you've got a year 12 mock and you've got a year 13 mock, should they have equal weight? Well, maybe not. Because if the student is showing signs of improvement over the 2 years, and if they produce maybe a grade C piece of work in year 12 and then a grade B piece of work more recently in year 13, then maybe you should give greater weight to the more recent piece of work. So that's something else to consider when you're looking at the weighting. Once you've done all of that, step 5 asks you to assign a grade. And there's a couple of ways in which you can check that out and sense check whether the grade you've assigned is something that is warranted by the evidence. And we've got 2 things that might be able to help you here. We have grade descriptors. Now the grade descriptors have been produced by the JCQ, and we've got grade exemplification, which is a very long document, hundreds of pages, that you might also be able to use to help with the grading. Now the grade descriptors, you'll see descriptors for grades A to E, descriptors of what performance at that particular level looks like. And that's something you can use to sense check the grade once you've assigned it to a particular student. So you've got grades A to E. We also have on our qualification pages a grade exemplification document. Now for this, I've put the 3 tables of contents from each of the papers here. You'll see that we have for each grade on papers 1, 2 and 3 an exemplar and a commentary. So the idea here is that if you want to get a feel for what a grade A answer looks like, you have a grade A answer, and you have some examiner's commentary as to why it's a grade A answer. And then that's repeated through the grades. Now this brings us on to sort of grade boundaries. Which grade boundaries might you use? And here the answer is unequivocally, you should use grade boundaries from 2017, 2018 and 2019. You should not use the 2020 grade boundaries. The autumn 2020 exam series was not a typical series and had a tiny fraction of the entry of a normal exam series. The cohort was not at all typical. So please do not use the 2020 grade boundaries. We also have a recording of an event that was recorded at the end of 2019 after the exam series, and it's a feedback event giving examples of good and bad practice. If you're looking for some marking training, then this is particularly quite good. It's a recorded training event you might want to listen to, and it would be a very good refresher on how to go about assessing any tests that you set. The centre policy also has a section on how you will use data, and there are 2 key points here. The first is historical data. We've got 3 reliable series from 2017 to 2019, and you can use the exam grades here, the historical data you have, as a reflective tool. Do your 2021 tags differ significantly from your 2017 to 2019 grades. If you've got a small number of candidates, say 10 or fewer each year, then historical data isn't going to be that significant. But let's say you've got 50 candidates, 60 candidates, then it's likely that the historical data is going to be much more significant. Now, you shouldn't assume that the data, your grades this year, have to be the same, because we're only looking at this year against 3 previous years. There could be a rationale for why there's a difference. If there is a difference, be prepared and have a written rationale to explain that difference. I mean, it could be for any number of reasons. This year, there have been different number of teaching resources available. You might have had different staff. I mean, there could be lots of reasons. But think about this historical data as something that you might be able to use. What's not appropriate is target grade data. It's very likely that in your centre you have some target grades for your students or predicted grades, but it's not at all appropriate to use that data as part of the thinking behind your tags. And the reason for that is the key difference between 2021 and 2020. In 2021, you were asked to submit CAGs, the centre assessed grades. And those CAGs in 2020 were based on a prediction of potential exam performance. The difference in 2021 is that your tags have to be based on evidence, not on potential. So in 2021, it has to be evidence that you have of students' work. So if you've got target grade data in your centre, that's not data that you should be using. I said I'd say something about the additional assessment materials that we've produced. Now, the underlying principle behind these was to group together all of the questions from a particular part of the specification and to give you a spreadsheet where you can check each of the sections of the specification. So let's say you want some questions on human resources, and then the spreadsheet would tell you where to find all the questions on section 1.4, for example, of our spec. Therefore, if you wanted to create a test on 1.4, you would be able to find those questions easily. So that was the underlying logic behind producing these materials. Some teachers I've spoken to have said they've already done all of the past questions. So what can they use? Can they use resources from a third party, for example? And yes, of course, that's possible. But rather than paying for resources, you might want to consider our international A-level papers, the IAL papers, and you can adapt those. The IAL business qualification uses the same command verbs and the same generic levels-based mark grids that A-level business does. So this gives you another source of potential questions that you could use. Clearly, the materials we've produced, these additional assessment materials, are not mandatory. And if you've used everything that we've produced already, it may be that you've already got enough evidence, so you might not need any more evidence. You may want to use it again if it was a long time ago, but you'd need to consider how appropriate that was, how long ago it was. But think about our IAL business papers, because you'll find case study questions with levels-based mark schemes that use the same command verbs as our A-level business, and that will give you some more questions you can use. Where to find these papers? When you go to the course materials tab and then teaching and learning materials, you'll see that it's expanded quite a bit recently. Third from the bottom is something as a tab called Summer 2021 Assessment Materials for Centres. And it's here that you'll find the additional assessment materials. And that's where they've been catalogued by specification link and specification point. There's a similar document underneath called Summer 2021 Assessment Materials for Students. That one isn't padlocked, but the student version doesn't include mark schemes or examiner comments. It just has the questions. With the reasonable adjustments, we're asking Senkos to still apply using Edexcel Online and to let us know about access arrangements so that they're on record. There's also a spreadsheet that we've produced with the additional assessment materials with details of the modified papers that we have available. Students will be able to appeal their grades, and part of the appeals process will look at your centre's policies and procedures. So documenting everything, not only the centre policy, but that assessment record is going to be very important. Let's finish with something about support and information, where else you can find it. The images on this slide have been taken from the Pearson Professional Development Academy, and in that, it's a separate website to the Pearson Qualifications website. In that Academy website, you'll find PDF documents to help you, as well as videos, podcasts with recordings on grading, on the appeals, on all the things that I've been talking about today. So there are some podcasts you might use there. There's also links that you can find on our website or in other places as well. And there are 6 links here. The first link is to the Summer 2021 support page. The second, though, is to the A-Level Business Summer 2021 support page. The first is to a generic page. We've also put a link to the Ofqual website, and the fourth link there relates to the Ofqual blog on quality assurance that talks about how sampling is going to work after the 18th of June. 2 links at the bottom. The fifth link is where you can sign up to receive regular bulletins from our assessment team. And the last link is to my May 2021 business update, which has also information relating to grading and the 5 steps. Finally, we also have a page with links to information you might want to share with your students and with their parents and carers. And they can also sign up to a newsletter just for parents and carers. Thank you very much for listening today, and I hope this has given you some food for thought, and it's answered some of the questions that you might have had in your mind about the tag process.